Fellas! My name is Ryan, and welcome back to the Forbidden Card Slots. You know the deal, bag goes on the head. Excellent, and now that we're complying with the law 100%, let's talk about how to build a goddamn deck. Story time. I took a Ryzeal cash tier list to my locals on Sunday. And I went 2-1-1. Now, I had never played the cards, and I had touched the cardboard for about, I'm going to say, 15 whole minutes, just while putting the cards in sleeves to play the deck. And I had this grand theory that the cash tier cards, by being both low to the ground engine that can chew through hand traps or punish hand traps, they can also produce a level 4 monster that doesn't care about being locked into Exceed with cash tier or Ryzeal, that I would be able to sneak out a few game wins. Let's talk about the reality. What actually happened? Well, I would say in 5 of the 11 games I played, I drew any usable Ryzeal card. In the other 6 games, I drew either no engine at all, so no Ryzeal, no Kashtira, only hand traps, or I drew only Kashtira cards, and a surplus of them. Now the Kashtira cards are only really effective. Excuse me. They're only really effective when you're drawing 1 Fenrir or 1 Unicorn. Ideally 1 Unicorn. And for anyone who's curious, the engine was 1 Planet, 3 Unicorn, 1 Fenrir, 1 Ryzeal, 1 Birth, 1 Theosis. Because this deck can play Theosis if it wants to, because you don't care about being locked into Exceed monsters. And the result was that I ended up playing a lot more pure Kashtira games than I would have preferred. The engines did not blend together at all, which is something you have to consider in the deck building process. And I think of the hand traps I played: 3 Ash, 3 Imperm, 3 Vela, 2 Nibiru, and 3 Ghost Ogre. And like some small amount of non-engine like Desires, Prosperity, Talents. I think overall the deck was 43 cards. Not where you want the deck to be. And of course you can say, Ryan, well, how can you possibly expect the deck to perform well when it isn't 40 cards? Look, 3 cards doesn't make that big of a difference when your sample size is only 11 games. Or 12 games in a 4-round tournament if you're playing all of the games out. My losses were drawing no Ryzeal cards for 2 full games in a match. That is just unacceptable. And I lost a game because my opponent went first, and I did draw all the Ryzeal cards, but no hand traps. So this begs the question: how do you build your deck in such a way that you draw equal components, engine, non-engine, otherwise? For those of you who are still wrestling with the concept of engine versus non-engine, let me explain to you what those concepts mean. And they derive from a book written about, I'm going to say, 14 years ago by the godfather of the game, Patrick Hoban, called Road of the King, who breaks down these different cards into their roles they perform in the deck. Now, as Yu-Gi-Oh! Has evolved, cards perform more than one role. But really what we're comparing is starter cards to, what was it? I forget what the non-engine's called. Defensive, let's just call them defensive cards. I might be getting that term wrong. But how many starter cards in your deck do you need to play versus how many defensive cards in your deck you need to play? Now back then, the maths leaned towards how many normal summons should your deck play, because everything started with the normal summon. You know, what normal summons do we have back then? Mermail, Abyss Pike, Alistair the Invoker, Mathematician, Armageddon Knight. How many of your normal summons that start your combo should you be playing in order to draw at least one of them every game, going first to second? And the math is to suggest about 6. These days, the game has evolved in such a way where pretty much every card in your deck can omnidirectionally get you to a starter or an extender. So, in terms of the Ryzeal deck, your main 9 monsters and the 3 bonfire that you use to get to them, / small world, / other cards you want to play to search the Ryzeal monsters directly, they are essentially superior starter cards. Now, I believe that was another role that Mr. Hoban defined, along with the creative talents of Johnny Lee. So how many of these starter cards should you play? Well, in a deck as powerful as Ryzeal, you should be aiming to play as many of those 1-card starter cards as physically possible. And we saw this with the Snake Eye deck. Toward its end of the lifespan, the Snake Eye deck could play 1 Ash, 1 Poplar, original Sinful Spoils with any face-up card would be fine, 3 Witch, 3 Wanted, 1 for 1, like Where Art Thou? Like, you had ways to increase the volume of starter cards, because accessing that 1 starter card meant you could perform your deck's entire game plan. So essentially, decks have been dissolved down or diluted down to which of my cards access my 1-card starter combo, and which of my cards prevent my opponent from accessing their 1-card starter combo, or perhaps prevent my opponent from interacting with my 1-card starter combo, considering cards like Talents, or Crossout, or Called By. Now, there is a fine balance to achieve between these 2 elements of your deck. And it really is a maths game, because you could say comfortably, well, I would only like to open, ideally, 1 of my starter cards in my hand, or maybe 1 or 2 of my starter cards in my hand, depending on how impactful those starters are. Is it still viewing it? Yeah, I've got my head in the frame, it's fun. Sorry to take the bag off, I know it was a bit of a shock. So in Snake Eye, you can play 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. You can play like 13, 14 starter cards if you really, really wanted to access the Edge that badly. In the Ryzeal deck, the current problem is that without playing cards that are hurtful to your own card advantage, like Small World, you can play 3 Ice, 3 Sword, 3 Exed, 3 Bonfire, and if you were desperate, you could play. I mean, I don't like Small World. Small World is quite a bad card, I think, in the game of card advantage. But I suppose it's better than not playing. So that's 12 copies. Now, statistically, if you played 12 copies of a card in your deck, you should expect to draw at least 1 of them in every hand in your deck. But should you not draw a starter card in your 40-card deck, you are now relying on either a supplemental engine, which has its own series of starter cards, or you are relying on a series of defensive tools that do not do anything by themselves. This is why the Fiendsmith Ryzeal deck was so popular, because if you weren't playing Ryzeal cards, you more or less had a Fiendsmith engine to lie back on. And if you had the Ryzeal cards, you could access the Fiendsmith engine anyway. Like I said, the way decks have evolved means that pretty much every card in your deck needs to omnidirectionally attach themselves to other engines. And if they don't do that, they are just not the superior choices in the room. This is why I somewhat dislike the Malice cards, because there is currently no other engine that works with them in such a way where you could use an engine and then generate a Malice card from that. But any 2 level 4s becomes Duo Drive, and any 2 level 4s becomes a Light Fiend to access Fiendsmith. Apologies for the sniffling. Let's grab a drink of water while we're here. Getting a bit thirsty after Korean barbecue. So, if you saving for the fact that Pure Ryzeal's coming out now, Pure Ryzeal in a month's time gets access to Twins of the Eclipse, which is a terrific follow-up card, and it is only a follow-up card. So let's imagine a Ryzeal deck that doesn't start with 6 Fiendsmith Engraver, 1 Lorry, 3 Lacrima, and 3 Tract. It doesn't have 10 additional starter cards for a different engine. If you don't have another 10 card engine in your deck, can you comfortably say that the Ryzeal cards are going to perform your game plan every single time? And I think the answer is no. Without access to cards like 7th Tachyon, we need to get far more creative with the way we approach building this deck. But this theory we can apply more generally to every kind of deck that's out there. Every deck requires, with some varied exceptions, requires a starter card in which to begin your game plan. Your deck actually needs to achieve something. When you sit down and start building a deck, you need to say to yourself, well, what exactly does my deck need to do? And that might be, my deck has a very stable game plan that it creates in a vacuum. For example, 1 card Snake Eye Ash combo does this many things, creates this many interruptions. Or do you say, my deck is a direct opponent to some of the better decks in the format? And we can, look, I'll use Runic Stun as an option because sometimes Runic Stun is a favoured deck in some matchups. Feeling all kinds of fat this evening. Once you have appropriately assigned what your deck is meant to do, then you need to find a volume of starter cards to achieve that in such a high number that you could comfortably do it like 95 games out of 100. It should be statistically very unlikely that you don't draw a single way to play the game. It can still happen. Not every deck is playing 40 engine cards, but it's something that you need to be considerate of. And then you need to decide, does my deck require the kind of defensive cards like hand traps, or can it play defensive cards like board breakers? Your defensive cards should not be the first things you put in your deck. A good defensive card should be cards that interact efficiently into the other decks in the format, and in niche scenarios be able to operate as an additional engine piece or link material or starter piece. The best example of this is Mulcharmy Thorlos. If you draw that card going first, it's not much good to your opponent. but it is a level 4 monster, which can be used to create your impromptu duo drive, because you're not using it for anything else. You're not using it to draw cards. So this is the sort of delicate balance that is required for deck building in Yu-Gi-Oh! Now, I don't think there is any substitute for just playing games and seeing what feels right. You can, by yourself, theory out what a deck should look like, but that should only ever be the starting piece of your deck. Excuse me. You might accidentally stumble on the best 40 cards in the room. And mathematically, it may make sense to play 40 cards. But I know from experience that sometimes you'd have to go outside the norm in order to find a style that is comfortable for you. Now, I'm not going to go and say something as cringe as, oh, well, the good duelist could pile 60 cards from a structure deck and still do well. It's not about the deck, it's about the pilot, says Mr. Caesar No Teeth. That's a deep cut to a cheater from Remote Duels ages ago. But the good decks are ones that have a solid theory behind them and have the testing and gradual modifications that come with the kind of experience you can only get from repetitive, structured gameplay. If you're looking for some decent ratios as non-engine to play, I think we can look at the Snake Eye deck as a great example. That deck was pretty much solved. Yeah, that deck was pretty much solved in terms of its consistency. People could increase the volume of starter cards if they wanted to, and they could pretty much play however many non-engine in whatever volumes they would like to. A 40 card Snake Eye deck would probably have, 18 starters. 18 seems like a more than reasonable number to have when you can pair that alongside cards like Crossout Designator or other defensive cards to prevent your opponent from getting any advantage. But with Ryzeal, people are still learning how that Ryzeal deck works. We've had an event, but was it YCS? YCS Anaheim is the only YCS event we are playing before Supreme Darkness. After Supreme Darkness, there is a big argument to play Pure, which then asks us to solve the problem. How do we fill in the gaps of the Pure Ryzeal deck such that we can still play it competently, without losing out too many games to the consistency issues brought on by the lack of 7th attack yard? And that is a challenge that I present to you. You could go ahead and copy the lists that you've already seen, and I think that is a terrific starting point. I think it's always fun to trust a person who has gone and done the testing and seen the results. But don't let that stop you from coming to your own conclusions about how to build a deck and in what ratios you'd like to see every card. I can't tell you that every single deck you see online is optimal. Sometimes just the more popular deck wins events, even if it's not statistically the best deck. You should come to the conclusion on your own. Test the deck. For me, I have completely burnt myself out on Kashtira Ryzeal after 4 rounds, which is perfect. That is one less thing I need to worry about when testing for YCS Sydney. Next step, all aboard! We're putting runic cards in the deck. Bye, bitches!